I'm about to say something I might regret, but howdy, y'all. Got an awesome guest this week. For those that don't know, I have with us today Fernando Rojo. He is the lead software developer and CTO at BeatGig, doing all of the client work, not just for web, but for mobile as well. And I'm excited to talk about all things React Native, navigation, Next.js, and the crazy cross of these three that you seem to find yourself in all the time. So yeah, welcome, Fernando. Great to have you here.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
So to get things started off, want to talk a bit about some of your projects, some of the cool things you've built, and the exciting things you've been working on as of recent?
Yeah, definitely. So like you mentioned before, I'm the co-founder of BeatGig. So we are a marketplace for booking artists, similar to something like Airbnb for live music. We started out just being a booking platform for fraternities and sororities across the country. And after COVID, we basically launched into the bar space and started growing into the more B2B markets. So we now service not just a majority of the fraternity and sorority concerts in the country, but also a huge percentage now. Well, at least we've been growing a lot in the bar and venue space in the South and also Northeast.
Good stuff. Good stuff. I was really impressed when I first used the product. Like I haven't installed the app because I'm not a person that is doing gigs myself,
Yeah.
but just like using the website was very surprised at how fluid everything felt, even like just resizing a window on desktop. I know that's like the stereotypical, how does this respond test, but I was really impressed with that. I'm curious, like knowing that you're a solo on this and that you're targeting so many platforms, I'd like to hear a bit more about like the design process in particular. Like how does one design and work with a designer who's designing a product that is in all of these different states and targeting all of these different platforms?
Yeah, I mean, this was kind of the first problem I faced, and it's why I made my first design library. So I built Dripsy, an open source design system powering library. Basically, it's kind of like Theme UI, but for React Native and web. And this was sort of the problem I was trying to solve is I need to build for iOS, Android, and web, and I also need responsive designs that are based on theme. So that process, I basically ended up deciding that everything should just be based on screen size, not platform. So it should look the same everywhere, and I should just know, like, all right, what is the size of the screen? And I just design responsively. And Dripsy itself, this library should handle all the kinks where web and iOS and Android are different. So I just have to, concern myself with using my theme and going based on the screen size.
Really rad. I personally have not had a chance to play with Dripsy, but I've looked over it a ton and was super impressed with like how natural the syntax felt, and also like a natural extension of something like styled components in the with an all-in-one solution, which was really wild. I personally put a lot of time trying to build like styled component wrappers into like or React Native myself, trying to share as much between the some web and mobile app experiments at Twitch, and the difficulty was absurd. I know that Dripsy would have saved us so much effort there. The one that I did get to play with, though, that's very exciting to me is Modi. And what's crazy there is I almost feel like you took the DX of something like styled components, the ability to just drop properties and define like a behavior to a component and how it looks, and managed to get that DX into animations, which was really crazy for me. The idea of just passing props to a component that says, hey, this appears at this time, it disappears at this time, it uses this. I feel like I haven't seen that much even outside of like within React, outside of React Native. And I'm curious what brought you to Modi and the idea of like prop-based animation patterns.
Yeah, I think it was, I started out building BeatGig, and we're building on iOS and web. And I feel like almost to a fault, I was like too obsessive over not writing platform specific code. Like I was like, I will not write platform.os. And for those who don't use React Native, basically this is a very common thing you do where you import this platform variable and you run different code based on which, if you're on iOS or Android or web. And I was like very obsessive about not doing that. So instead, I would just use like CSS keyframes, and it would only work on the website, and my app would have no animations, and it like really sucked. And so then I'd be like, okay, I can use the animated API from React Native, but like it's just really cumbersome to use. You're importing a function and like running, timing.start or something like that. It just it's a really bad API. And so then I think I was doing a web only project on the side for a few months, and I used like Framer Motion and Spring and React Spring and just like some CSS keyframes. And I was like, this is just all of them are getting into the right spot. And then once I started like getting more into Framer Motion, I was like, I need this for native. So there was this like long running thread about making framer motion work for React Native. And right around that time, Software Mansion put out like an alpha version of Reanimated 2. This was like summer of 2020, I think, or 2021, I forget. And I remember thinking like, oh, okay, what if there's a way to bring Framer's API into React Native, and then if Reanimated ends up working for web, you just get Framer for both, essentially, something like that, but with native performance on each platform. So that's kind of how it came about, and it now powers basically all the animations on our website and our app.
That's really rad. I am almost positive it was 2021 because I remember that whole like wide series of events and dealing with both the joy and the pain of React Native Reanimated 2. The joy being, oh my god, the DX is like the thing that we needed from day one. And like React Native Reanimated 1 was like the assembly of animation almost, where it could do anything, but you had to do all of it. Yep.
I had this kind of rule where it's like, if I can tell something's just like not going to be worth learning, I just didn't. And so sometimes I would like copy, someone would have a whole function for how to loop. And it's like, you start this clock and you do all this stuff. And I was like, I'm not going to learn this. Like, I'll just wait. So once Reanimated 2 came out, that really changed the game. In addition to just having better performance, just the developer experience was a lot better. But yeah, like you mentioned before, just having like plain props and objects, I think is a great API. I actually find just you want to have to import the lowest number of things. Anything that you don't have to import is just a lot better. You can write a lot faster. If your auto import isn't working properly, or just there's so many things that can go wrong. And then chaining functions together can be very hard to read if you come back to later. But looking at a dictionary or an array is pretty straightforward, I find.
Totally agree. The other part of what I like in particular with both React Native Reanimated 2 and in particular React Spring by the Poimanders guys is the idea of compositional animation and having like properties that affect properties that affect properties that affect the component, and how I'm super FP brain. I love the like composability of functions, and I feel like hooks almost forced API designers and developers to be more considerate of those patterns, and it really showed in Reanimated 2.
Yeah, I've actually been working on adding that kind of pattern to Modi in general, where it's not really documented, but it actually already works now, where for those who are familiar with how Reanimated works, you can actually pass worklets to most Modi props now. So for example, the transition prop, which is the same as Framer's transition prop, essentially, which lets you set, type timing or spring for any animation. Many times you want to set, for example, a different duration of your animation based on some other animated value. So say you're swiping your finger on something, and if you've swiped more than 100 pixels to the right, you want the animation duration to change. You don't really want to do a state update for that, because then you're triggering a re-render based on an animation. So any Modi prop like transition, you can actually just pass the result of use derived value from Reanimated. And that way you can use shared values inside any of these props. And so you kind of get the best of both worlds, which is you can pass a plain object, or you can pass a shared value, which updates reactively based on other shared values. And so it allows both for this composition. But in most cases, if you just need a plain object, you can do that as well.
That pattern almost reminds me of like, we talk a lot about Solid.js here. It's just a super fascinating framework. I don't know if you're particularly familiar with it.
I'm actually not.
Oh,
I've heard of it, but I've never tried it.
TLDR, like graph-based observable update system with JSX. It's trying to be like MobX plus JSX with everything else removed to be as fast as possible, and it tends to be like the fastest framework in a lot of benchmarks. I'm also friendly with Ryan, the creator, and I think they're up to some really clever stuff there.
I remember this getting released, I think a few months ago, at least, when I came across it as like a React competitor, right? Like it seems like it was inspired by a lot of it, but it didn't use like the hooks. Like it seemed, if I remember correctly, is this the one that's just reactive, kind of based on a signal?
Yes. It's signal primitives are the big strength there. And what's really interesting there is it feels like React to an extent as you're writing it, where it's like DX is very similar. It doesn't have a true component model because components don't re-render. Components do a single render pass, and then the reactive values do updates. But that means you can do crazy things like just drop one of those reactive values into like JSX bound styles, and that value will only update that specific CSS and nothing else in your entire DOM. You don't have to think about re-renders. You just think about that chain of events and that specific thing that's being updated. Sure. It almost feels like you kind of faked that with the Modi derived values, where you're chaining these values down, and they are triggering updates, but not through React, through the pipe of data going to the native thing that is actually doing that re-rendering. It reminds me
Yeah,
of the
exactly.
solid flow of that reactivity, but it's cool that you managed to get that inside of React.
Yeah, I mean, technically speaking, I'm just getting to build on top of the stuff that the reanimated team has built, which is, makes it easy for my end. And the way I did it is just start with the API first, and then I try to figure out how to build it. And I feel like that's how I like to do most of these kind of library things. It's just I write the prop types, and then I kind of go from there.
I think that shows in the way that you build. And in this era, that's not necessarily a guarantee. I've seen a lot of projects where it feels like tech trying to find the problem that it solves rather than a problem being worked backwards from to find like very specific technology. I'm curious if there are like other libraries that have inspired you to be more like implementation detail focused. Like it almost feels like Reanimated
Yeah.
inspired you to make something more close to the user and the developer that's implementing for the user, where React Native Reanimated provided the primitives for you to make a library for others to build with.
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where there are always a lot of good options out there when you're building with React Native, but I think the thing that kind of made me want to build certain kinds of APIs is just the way I would code when I was a kid. I didn't like program a lot, but I would sometimes make websites. And I just have this like very distinct memory of I was like 10 or 11, and my dad just like got me an HTML book and opened this like text file and just wrote like my name.html and just dragged it into a browser. And then I had a website. I was like, oh, that's what a website is. And like that's just I didn't realize that that's all a website was. It was just like a text file, and then you just display it. And then he was like, "This is what a div is," and I was like, "Oh, so it's just." And then I would compare it to what I would see online. Like that's what I always come back to when I'm looking, when I'm trying to reflect on like why I come up with APIs and stuff. Um, I feel like you really want to minimize the time between thinking about something and being able to build it. And so, what kind of the other libraries that I feel like I've been inspired by is like Expo and Next, both independently, are pretty good at that. I mean, building a website in general is tough today because you need to know these concepts like Webpack and these like difficult, like weird config tools. And so I feel like the frameworks that abstract that away get us closer to this index.html path, which is just like you create a file and you have a product. So I've been inspired by those kinds of libraries, mostly just thinking like, what is the minimum amount of time? And when someone creates an issue, like what is the minimum code they need to kind of show you what they were trying to do? So I feel like most Modi issues, the code samples are pretty small because it's all just encapsulated in one object. And then the other thing in general is just like I was pretty hesitant to ever use the animated API. This like the basic one from React Native, because I just always heard it didn't have as good of performance as reanimated. But then I had trouble figuring out how to use reanimated. So I would use like just very few animations in general. So once these better libraries started coming out, I was like, okay, now I need to actually like add better animations into our apps and have it be just much easier to use.
Try to find the right way to frame what I want to ask. It's almost like a certain threshold had to be met in the quality of DX around performant animations in React Native for somebody like you to appear, and then improve the DX further enough for the next crew. Because I played with React
Yeah.
Native Reanimated. I used it for one or two things. I didn't have the time to like build the things I wanted to with it. And Modi made it very easy for us to just add nice touches to our app as we were building. Do you feel the same pattern too, where like by this threshold being met of quality, you were able to increase the threshold even further and get even more people in?
Yeah, definitely. I think it's just like I think it's easy to take for granted when you've been building with a certain software for enough time that it feels very easy. I think this is kind of the trap that a lot of open source people also fall into, and just what I see a lot from like the very best people kind of don't really see much of a new need to improve things anymore because they've been building the same app for like 15 months, and they have every like reusable piece they need. What kind of informed our situation was we were pivoting a lot, so we were constantly starting new projects, and each time I like got a little bit more ambitious. Like the first time we just built an iOS app, and then we built a web app, and then we wanted to build iOS and web, and then we wanted to do iOS, web, and Android. And so each time I was trying to like fit more stuff in, and every time because we were starting from scratch, like obviously I could copy some code over, but I wanted like a really easy starting point DX. So reanimated 2 alone wasn't really enough. Now I feel like when we try to spin up like a quick snack or just any kind of thing, I feel like the tools we have are a lot easier. So I don't know if someone's going to wrap Modi one day with something better. I mean, I could, potentially maybe even those APIs could be more high level. But up until now, it seems like it's enough to at least get you started, and you don't really have to know anything about animations or React really. Is like as long as you can write JSX, you can have pretty good animations as long as you can, just do a from opacity 0 and animate opacity 1.
Really interesting. You touched on so many cool things there, and I'm gonna let us get distracted by one of them. The idea that developers, in particular, like open source maintainers, hit a certain point where they're like comfortable with the way things work and they're less willing to challenge themselves to improve. I've personally experienced this more than I ever would have expected around something that is incredibly frustrating for me. The idea of like type safe boundaries in Next.js between the backend and the front end. I know you've done some fun investigation here, in particular, like path pedoland for like pathing of routes in Next.js and maintaining like safe routing or practice through that. I'm much more interested in the relationship between backend and front end and how I can write a function that calls something from DB and gives it to my component with type safety between those that I didn't have to write myself. And there's a level of content in the Next.js community, and in particular, like the Next.js maintainers of, well, you can just define the type and use a generic on the client and on the server. And if it's the same generic, it's now type safe, right? And I just could not agree less. I fundamentally believe type safety is not something you write, it's something you infer from a source of truth. And it's weird how hard it is to challenge some people because the thing they have now has worked for long enough and for big enough companies and for enough big projects that clearly we don't need to improve this more. And I'll never understand that.
Yeah, type safety is actually very fundamental to our stack, especially for sharing front and back end. To give you context, we never write a fetch function. I haven't written a single fetch function in BeatGig. All of our front and back end code is code-gen. The way it works is just every time our backend deploys, it code-gens a REST library that and publishes that to npm, and our front end imports that, and that includes shared enums and types and everything. So I don't ever actually write a single type. I just import those from our backend. I know that there are like a lot of projects that are similar to that. Another one we have now is just doing that through GraphQL, and we started using a graph database recently with GraphQL for the backend. And even our backend has a typed pedantic Python ORM that goes to straight, inference types from Python classes into graph database types. And then our front end imports all those exact same types. So whenever it comes to app data, I actually haven't written any types for example, if something's getting sent to the server, I just import the argument of the post request, and that's it. If I'm calling something, I just get to use all those types. I think there's just no question I could go without that. I think types are probably the most important part of our entire stack because our first app was just plain JavaScript. And once you ship a feature, you can never edit it, really. You can never safely edit it because you can just have a typo. We basically just have no breaking bugs that are involved from front and back end that aren't network errors at this point. We have just zero downtime or zero crashes because of that. It's just because of the types. I feel like it's definitely underutilized, or like there's some cool projects out there, but I'm surprised it's not a bigger priority in general. For us, it's just so crucial. We're just two people and the backend ships a breaking change or something, and I just update the types. Like the amount of times we say every day, like, oh, can you update the types? Just means like npm install, our private npm package, and that's it.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. The amount of time I have personally saved in outages and just like time on my life from having like true proper type safety across our entire stack. I do not get how anyone can ship anything without it. And like even yesterday, we redid the entire permission system for ping over the last like day and a half or 2 days. It was one of the first contributions of a newer person on the team. He was scared shitless, shipped it, and the only thing that broke was we had a single place where we were filtering an array and selecting the first thing from it, and that thing might not exist, and TypeScript wasn't smart enough to say it could be undefined, so we assumed it was defined, and that's the only error that was thrown after rebuilding the entire our entire permission system. And I found a flag that I now fundamentally believe should be on by default.
Strict null checks?
No, strict null checks was on. Oh. Strict null checks, I would never work in a code base that doesn't have strict null checks on. The rule I have it, it's no unchecked index access is the rule. What? And if you don't already have it on, you should go turn it on. It will save you at some point. So what happens for this rule is if you have an array of things
Mm-hmm.
that is typed as like this array is of users, I want the 0th user. So you select like user 0 and bind that to like user 0 or
Oh,
whatever. That is
this just
now,
happened to me today. Yeah.
yeah, there's a rule for this happened. This caused an outage for us today that we just fixed. But that's the,
So you're saying that the item could be undefined, but it marks it as defined if it's an
yes,
item in an. So you do like 0th index, and the 0th index doesn't exist, but because the object itself is required, it assumes it exists.
correct.
Is that what you're saying? Yeah.
Yes.
I have a similar issue actually. I don't know if it's on an index, so maybe this would happen, but this happened to me today where I just like TypeScript didn't assume something would be undefined, and I know it will potentially be undefined. So I defined a state variable as just a dictionary, just use state as a dictionary and as keys and values. And then later in the code, I wrote, state and then passed it a potential ID. So it's just state, and then I'm using an ID variable and then dot something, and it just didn't complain, right? Because the state, the use state function is typed as a dictionary with required keys and values, and so it just assumes if I'm giving to this that it was required. So maybe this rule would fix that for this object too.
I don't think,
I'd have to see.
yeah, I don't think it would. This is specifically for selecting off indexes. So it's if you have
Yeah.
like an iterable in JavaScript and you're using a numbered index to select from it, TypeScript by default assumes that thing exists and that you're selecting it correctly, which is a bad assumption to make. You should be forced to check that that thing exists or assert.
Yeah,
that
I mean,
it
I
does
always would
manually.
want a false positive.
Yes.
I would pick a false positive checking with a question mark, 100 times out of 100.
The fix for this, to be clear, was just the question mark after
Yeah.
when we select, but we didn't know we needed the question mark because the rule was assuming the thing existed. Very
This is
easy mistake
yeah,
to
it's
make.
pretty underrated. Yeah, that's a big one. It's pretty underrated. The addition of the question mark in TypeScript. That's probably the biggest difference that 1 to 2 characters has ever made in coding for me. Like no question. Like I can still remember writing like artist and artist.id and just keep chaining it. And it's all in JavaScript, so I just had no idea where it might be nullable. I was just going on for days and just like constant source of bugs. Like my Sentry would just blow up over this.
Yep. The need to check for if something exists at the top level is so frustrating and is. I think there have been a handful of things that have unraveled this problem. The first one is moving away from class components and not needing to do this props thing stuff, and the practice of like having a component that was a big class named like menu, and it would take header props and body props and footer props, and then each of those would have nested objects that all could be nullable, and then you're doing like 15 layers of if checks before you get one value.
Yeah.
Optional chaining made that way better. What's interesting with optional chaining, and it's actually one of the first times I saw this happen, it was approved by the ECMA standard to be added to ES8 or I forgot what it's or iteration of TypeScript or JavaScript, but it is in official JavaScript now. It is in Chrome. You can natively do optional chaining.
Oh, I didn't know that. Okay.
TypeScript, the moment it was approved and made it to stage 4, TypeScript was like, okay, cool. This makes our lives way better too. We're just going to add it in early and wait for everyone else to catch up, knowing that it's going to be in now. And they added nullish coalescence, which is the double question mark for nullish overriding, and the optional chaining in the same like major TypeScript update, because both got approved for JavaScript. So you can use a precompiler now, knowing that in the future you won't even have to.
Yeah, I remember that was huge. I'm pretty sure they had that issue for like years and years open. Like I want to say it was like over 5 years, maybe even longer. I feel like I remember seeing from like 2012 or something a TypeScript issue about this, and they were right, understandably kind of waiting off until there was more sort of official approval for it. But that was like I was checking that stuff, really all the time. I just can't believe I started writing plain JavaScript. It's like it makes me nervous just I can't even do it for an example app now. Like if I make a snack, like I write bugs all the time if I use JavaScript, because I'm very into just refactoring, like kind of like if I need to do it, I just go ahead and do it. I'll move files around like totally openly, like all the time. Like I don't like keeping things in place if it's not sort of how I should. And all that just goes out the door without having types you can really trust.
Absolutely. I very much want to pick your brain on TRPC in the future. I have a feeling it will have a couple like mind-blowing moments for you when you realize what it looks like to have all the things that we get out of type safety without having the code generation, the installation, and the middleware. Like those are all so much better than the alternative of not having the type safety. But when the type safety is a consequence of the definition of a backend function and everything else is inferred from there, it's really cool. And I think the work that Alex has done, especially with like the Zart mono repo, where he has a Next.js app that also deploys the backend like server and a mobile app that share the same client that is underneath the hood, literally just React query and fetch functions, but it
Yeah.
uses the type definitions from the router that you define on the back end, and it imports the types directly in the client because the types get killed when you compile the app. You could safely import from the backend itself in your front end and not have to do any code gen at all. You're just importing from backend.
Yeah, no, that is really cool. I think it's that and Blitz. Like, there are definitely some cool ones out there. It's tricky because I feel like I kind of am not in a great position to appreciate these projects sufficiently because my constraints are just a bit out of it. So in the case of Blitz, it's just too focused on the web. This is something that's like the same for Remix for me that I'm kind of bummed about. It's like you have these cool projects that I'd love to try out, but they're just all for web projects, and we need both web and native. So that's just one. And the other piece for something like TRPC, it actually looks super cool. I'm just not writing backend code. Like it's just not anything I do. And we write all our backend in Python. So, and luckily there are good enough code gen tools for us to be able to connect the two super seamlessly. And it's with GraphQL, it's just I just need an endpoint and I code gen it all. Obviously, using code gen types isn't technically perfect because there's still like potentially some sort of lag for a breaking change. But if the code gen's good enough, at least in our case, that's worked well enough. So I definitely think those are super cool. It's just I feel like I'm not gonna have as big of a light bulb as probably most people would for something like TRPC because I just don't write backend code.
I want to quickly push back on that, but I want to do a cool new framing of this right after. So the pushback there is I was a backend dev that moved fully to front end because I was just having so much more fun there when like Twitch moved to React and TypeScript and I got to help push that move. It was just so much more rewarding for me to spend my time in the front end. And GraphQL in particular enabled me to move fully to front end because now we had a thing called the schema that I could sit in a room with the backend team, complain at them for long enough until we have a piece of paper that describes the exact shape of the data that I'll receive in the future and how I will be querying it. We fuck off for 3 months, come back, and it works. That was magic and let me focus more on front end. TRPC has undone that for me in the coolest way where I don't necessarily think of them as different anymore. And that's been really cool for me. It's made me enjoy backend and not feel the need to have backend developers anywhere near as much anymore. It's almost like React Native for backend, if that makes sense for me, where it lets me take the skill I developed of like TypeScript and solutions in TypeScript and go just like a couple layers deeper until all of a sudden I'm in my database again.
Okay, so tell me a little bit more about how it works then. Like, are you querying the database from the front end? Because I actually, to be frank, I don't love that concept. I prefer to view the servers a bit or at least in our. So take our example, right? We have a booking. A user creates a booking. A booking is an incredibly complex object because it has a ton of relationships. So for example, you create a booking and there's a venue potentially associated, but it could be nullable because we also have a college student or other kinds of users or a wedding that booked it. We might have one or multiple artists associated to the booking. Then we have payments associated to it. And every one of these objects then has nested relationships. So the reason GraphQL is, at least as a querying language, is nice for me is I can do like, I create a booking and then I query the booking and then I can do the artist and then I can do a number of times the artist has been booked by this venue from the, you can do like in a graph database, you can then use these variables from the original booking in the query. So I wonder what you're describing. Are you trying to like have the front end know what the database is? Because we kind of treat the server as the middleware between the two, or what is the sort of
So,
relationship here that TRPC is solving?
so the relationship here is the idea of my backend being a set of functions that my front end calls. My front end doesn't own the functions. It doesn't care about the contents of the function. It cares about the input, the validation of that input, and the output that I then like consume. So my general flow, like I had like a booking that I was creating. I use Prisma very heavily. I love Prisma as like a translation layer between SQL and TypeScript, where if our SQL is defined, we get
Sure.
proper types out of it. So I would define a query in TRPC that is just input, define like using a Zod validator or whatever other validation schema I want to say, here's what the input this takes is, and then you have an async resolve function that returns something. It could do whatever the
Yeah.
hell it wants there, and whatever it returns is now the signature of what that endpoint returns. So it's
Yeah.
effectively you write a function and it generates an endpoint. What it's actually doing under the hood is there is a single like Next.js API like route that it creates that's a generic catch-all TRPC. And then when you make calls to it with a specific like query string, it identifies which query that matches to, runs that function, gives you the return. And on the client side, you type trpc.useQuery, which is React Query under the hood, and it will autocomplete the names of all the different things you defined in the backend and give you the correct type inference of the inputs and outputs, because it's, in this case, in the same code base in Next.js, but you can also export that as a package and import it somewhere else and still get those same type definitions. In the end, all trpc is on the client is a React Query wrapper with all of the fetch calls baked in.
Okay. Yeah. So that's essentially what we actually have currently with our code gen setup, which is like very similarly, I just import like use user and it has a typed user. And then I import use create user. And all of that is typed for our queries and mutations, both in the case of REST and for GraphQL. So for REST, we're just using Swagger, which generates a JSON schema, of our backend based on whatever the backend expects as inputs and outputs. And it just generated type functions based on that. So I guess similarly from the front end perspective, I'm just, it seems like it's doing a similar thing. I might be missing some bit of the magic, but at least from that description, it seems like the developer experience is the nice thing that I like about our code gen setup. I understand that you don't technically code gen because it's in the same code base, which is nice.
The magic is the layers that are
Do you think that I'm
unfurled,
missing
if
it?
that makes sense. Like, I'm trying to find the right way to explain it. There's so much that's lost in translation when you have a layer like a GraphQL or a Swagger. And I'll say, like, very specifically, TRPC makes no sense whatsoever if you aren't using TypeScript for your front end and your back end, and you're not willing to like use TypeScript as the primary like back end like source of truth for your application. The way we use it is I have like a SQL database on Planet Scale that is like our infinitely scaling serverless database. I have a single Next.js application that is the entirety of our service. It's the marketing site, it's the core app experience, and it's our entire backend. And our entire backend is pretty much that one single API slash TRPC function that's a chain of like 70 plus however many queries and mutations we have across the app that we then go call wherever. And what this means is if I make a change to my schema, if I make a change to one of my like endpoints, I change the shape of the data I'm returning. I want to return a date time and actually have that be a date time in my front end. I want to make a map and have that map come through. I also have a super JSON transformer between the TRPC backend and front end that allow me to just take any object, as long as like anything but a function, pretty much I can pass from back to front, have the type safety like honored, and the shape of that object maintained. It's This is what I mean by like you stop thinking about the difference between backend and front end. It's not that I don't have things that run on a server and things that run on a client and they're different. It's the bridge between the two isn't a bridge. It's just like the pieces of land have now collided and they're right there next to each other for the first time.
So it's basically like the backend is nothing more than a secure runtime for your front end, and that's it.
Yes.
And you're sharing the same functions across both. Like I assume you're sharing runtime code across both. That part's definitely
Yep.
nice. I feel like if we had a full TypeScript stack, we would be doing that regardless. Like we would obviously just be sharing some functions between them. Like valid. We've actually tinkered with doing shared functions between Python and JavaScript for this in some way, like having a standardized thing. I think we figured out types and enums for our cross language stack with this sort of cogen. But one thing we had, for example, if let's say we want to get have a just like a pure function of is a user a venue buyer, because we have restaurants, we have nightclubs, we have bars, we have some ambiguous ones, and so I just want to have a function that's like user dot is venue buyer, and we both create that separately. I think that's one place where it's just like for Boolean creating functions based on some object without doing any sort of network request. That would be a huge time saver in general for us for having a same language stack. It's just probably not something as it stands we're gonna end up doing, but it definitely seems like that's where some level of the future is, where TypeScript backends like are totally able to do the same thing that kind of any other language can. Obviously, the more code you can share, it seems much more beneficial.
Here's where I want to bring in the other framing that I think makes a lot of sense here. You're very interesting in that I feel like we're in an era of increasingly vertical developers where a developer cares about their SQL, their backend, their front end, their style library, and like from the user to the SQL. I'm seeing more like true full stack, so to speak, developers that own everything. You're one of the most horizontal developers I've ever seen, where you are everything in the client layer and like pretty like thick chunk of that client layer, but drop off pretty significantly once things hit the server again. And it's really
Yeah.
interesting because I think, like as you said, the current trends, stuff like what's going on with Remix and some of these other like frameworks, uh, don't apply to you anywhere near as significantly due to this inherent difference of where your focus is and at the same time you're doing your own innovation as a result with things like Dripsy, Modi, and the work for React Native or compiling to Next.js, where you are trying to get some of those vertical wins in your horizontal position.
Yeah, I'm especially I don't want to like put this the wrong way because this is kind of like the losing sentence always, but we don't have a problem with our back end to front end connection for the most part, but we have a lot of problem. I have a lot of problems in general with shipping cross platform. So I feel like I focus a lot of there are a lot of things like I feel like me focusing on a single language full stack framework would be perfect. You know, like the sort of if we had TypeScript on front and back end, like that sounds like really ideal. And I've had a lot of people be ask me like why I don't focus more on that because it seems to be I think I've, built some sort of a reputation for wanting to have like one code base for everything. It's more just that I want to be able to ship great products to as many people as easily as possible. And our bottlenecks are like cross-platform front ends. That's like, that feel really fast and are smooth. And so since we don't have any bottlenecks currently with our shipping process of having sort of separated front ends and back ends, I think this is one of the benefits of just having a co-founder is that neither of us knows what each other does essentially. Like we do, but like I don't know I really know anything about the back end. And as a result, it's just like I can focus on like so deeply on these problems without having to ever think about like tracking, if the server's up or down or like any sort of maintenance stuff or like I don't even know how like the caching works for a server or like we used to do serverless and now we don't. Like I don't have to concern myself with any of this stuff, which I think frees me to get more into the, down to the middle of the what of the front end things, which I guess it sounds like you don't love the term because you're moving more towards just like a single stack, which I think is really cool, and I could totally see why that's the trend. So maybe maybe that'll be something that I'll be interested at some point if I think it'd make a ship faster than we do now.
I do like the term. I just think that it's slowly changing such that like front end means something different for everyone now. For some people, front end means
Mm.
close to a designer. For others, front end means somebody who knows all about deploying at the edge and all the like consequences of the caching and
Right.
like stuff there. I think it's somewhere in between the two that and relatively wide, but I get why people differ so much on where they fall there. My Term the right way to frame this. I don't think my recommendations make a lot of sense for people who want and have good reason to have a separate back end and front end person or team. And what's interesting is you've almost built like a full company structure in your little two-person team where there usually is a front end team and a back end team. Even like when I was at Twitch on the chat team, chat was split where there was half back end chat, half front end chat. Okay, it was like a third front end, a third back end, a vague full stack, but all the full stack people fell on one side pretty clearly. Like I was one of the full stack and I clearly
Yeah.
fell front end. And it's interesting how natural that pattern feels. Even now, I like with this very full stack we have where everything is just as easy to edit and change. I feel like there's trends forming where certain developers lean more towards the backendy stuff, lean more towards the like user facing clienty stuff, and some don't at all. And like I have two developers on my team that are as full stack as you can get. I can throw them a problem not knowing where it falls and trust them to solve it. And while I do firmly believe that's the future, I don't think that's the definitive end. And it's a hard line to walk right now.
Yeah, I think it actually does make sense to separate. And like I can think of many cases where we each have very unique problems we have to solve. I think this kind of maybe there's a reason where this is a natural outcome for them to separate in some sense. Like for example, Our payments are incredibly complicated, and I don't really know how all of it works, but my co-founder does. It's just the backend payments. So, we use Stripe. Everyone uses Stripe. It's like really simple and it's great. But we have to do ACH because we're doing such large transaction volume for all of our customers that no one wants to pay 3% on it. And we don't want to absorb a 3% fee for it. We're just very we each have our strengths there on what kind of stuff we're good at. And they just happen to sort of fall into like, dealing with those payment problems is gonna fall more in a back end person in general, at least in our case. But I mean, I'm sure I could, it's not like I've never spun up node servers and things like that. But for our process of shipping, there's something nice of just like trusting, a person that like you can't. The fact that we kind of can't even step in on each other's work, I think, is been sort of a beneficial thing because it's just like it's so obvious who's responsible and the clear separation of concerns. Like basically every time we're building a feature, it's like, all right, is this harder for us, for you or me? Like, that's kind of like the first question we always have. Is this more of like a front end problem or a back end problem? We're building some products right now that are like way more of a front end problem. So we know, all right, the back end can just like get other features ready because the back end is usually more the blocker. In our case, it needs to come up with the schema and the endpoints so that the front end can kind of go to work.
Yeah, that is really interesting. We're in a similar spot, or I don't want to say similar spot. We're in a spot now where I feel like I could see some of the benefit there, where we have like a feature or a bug that comes up and don't usually have special enough specialists that one person sticks out as this is the person who should go do that. It's almost gotten to a point where it's either like we have three types of tasks. We have tasks that are like UI and design heavy, that are design heavy developers should do it. We have tasks that are nasty, fucked up, or WebRTC related enough that I should probably do it. And then we have everything else, which is the majority of the work that literally anyone could pick up at any time, and I'm confident they could do it. It's cool how our team is flexible enough to just take anything to an extent, and I can trust them on it. But at the same time, it makes divvying things up harder at times because there's no clear, this is the person who owns this for the majority of our work.
That's not, yeah, that's interesting. It's kind of the opposite. Like it's just, there's never been even a question because it's just like anytime we get a sentry hit, I'm like, oh, I know what line this is. Yeah, I know this file. And it's like, it's just me. And then if it's a backend sentry hit, it's like, oh yeah, I know, look, give me a second. Um, like it's always so clear that I think, it also just, like, makes it more if there's, like, a problem that's just, like, just me, I'm not blocking anyone else or, like, my co-founder doesn't have to, like, be focused on it because it's just, I have to solve this. Obviously, sometimes there are some things that are both, but usually it's just, like, someone writes a line or, like, forgets to do some little thing, and I guess that's why it's kind of worked for us. Similarly, it's nice for features where if a schema on the back end is done or endpoints are done and there's no screen yet, it's like, all right, so it's so obvious that I'm not pulling my weight if that were to happen. Luckily we always try to hit our deadlines and everything, but like it's super clear whose responsibility it is to get something done. So I feel like that's kind of worked for us so far. But yeah, it's pretty cool to kind of unify it all. I haven't really seen apps that are like using Next.js API routes that much. I've usually heard about people just spinning up actual servers. Like I've definitely done it for quick things. It's intriguing to see that people are just using like the slash API for a lot of their actual product endpoints.
To be fair, we only have like 5/API endpoints. It's our auth endpoint, our TRPC endpoint, a
Yeah,
Stripe listener, and like a pusher auth listener, some other random thing probably. I think guys have like a cron somewhere in there too. But that TRPC endpoint is doing a lot of heavy lifting. And I've actually been able to take, so Next.js's API pattern is abstractable into Vercel directly. So you don't have to use Next.js to be able to define a slash API. And I was able to take a Next.js app that I built with like a TRPC or backend and port that to be a client side a solid.js app that still has the server side TRPC Lambda served by Vercel with almost no code change, which was super cool. Like switching frameworks entirely and render patterns without having to change any of the backend or how the communication between things was defined.
yeah. It's just it's not that much something I know much about. What I know a good amount about at this point is the navigation for Next.js and how to kind of think about that and pair it over to React Native. I've been spending a lot of time on that over the last few weeks. Namely, we're sharing code between our apps. Like navigating is just so hard to get right between the two platforms. And I've been working on a new library that I think is going to solve most of it. It's going to be very little code and mostly docs. Originally, it started out as a ton of code, and now it's going to be very little code. There's definitely been a lot of issue with lack of type safety from Next Router, but I feel like I'm kind of circumventing that, and I've actually been adding in some things to Next.js primitives. So, for example, Next.js exports a type called app props, and I think a type called next page. I've been extending those to add things like navigation options to pages and adding things like per page layouts in case you want to have just a different kind of app.js file for each page. So maybe like all your pages in slash dashboard share kind of a layout container. So things like that I've always found to be much easier on native. So I've been bringing a lot of like native patterns to Next there, and it's I've been working on this for so long, and I feel like it's finally starting to kind of make sense for the first time. But you mentioned that you'd had some issues with type safety on Next.js before, and particularly for getting around routes, and that's kind of like my last frontier. So I've been, trying with some libraries, but in general, for getting around, I think it's been exciting to bring some native patterns into Next.js.
That is really interesting. I've been lucky in that we have, I think, 5 pages for our app right now, which has been phenomenal
That's nice.
for
Yeah,
not having to worry
we
about
have
those
like a
things.
hundred.
Yeah, and with 5 pages, we've still managed to cause at least 8 or 9 major routing issues. And I would imagine that's going to go
Yeah,
up exponentially as the number of pages increases linearly. So I
yeah.
am very much interested in the idea of like type safe routing. I'm friendly with Tanner Lindsley, the creator of React Query and a bunch of other like the TanStack React libraries, like a React Table. He recently put out React Location, which was a really interesting,
Mhm.
very client side router, but it had some cool ideas in it around like query parameters of first class citizen and like type safe and like type consistency with data loading as like a first class pattern within too. So it was a really cool combination. It almost felt like client side remix data loading combined with type safe query param property management and general reliability of path plus properties equals result. And I have wished for this on the server since. And path PETA is a piece, and I'm really curious how you want to solve the puzzle here.
I just don't really know. I feel like unfortunately I haven't built a lot of like code gen type tools to like feel confident in building that myself. So I've been using PathPeter right now. It's like good. Like it's definitely like the best thing I've come across in that you can mainly define your types and you just have to be smart enough to ensure you use those types in the right places and that you don't forget to or something because like use router from next is just not typed. So you can basically assume you have any key in your query inside of there. So you just have to be a little bit careful. I've basically just been writing typed wrappers for everything. So I have this hook called use param, which is just query parameters state, and you can update it and as if you're calling set state. And it also works on native. So on web, it'll read and write to the query parameter. And also in between, it'll parse the query parameter. So if you write like a number to the URL, so if you do like, booking amount equals 2000, that's in the URL, it's always going to read in as a string. So you can put a function in the middle that reads in your query parameters and turns that into a number. React location looks pretty interesting. I'd come across this before, but I don't. It's the kind of things like I always want to play with, but if it doesn't work with Next, it's just like hard for me to kind of start using. But I love the idea of like a delayed page route. And something I've always wanted for this is like when I click a link, I want to kind of suspend changing the page until that other page is loaded. And like, so, if I click like open artist and that artist page is really expensive, I want to just like show a quick spinner until I've opened that page. And so I feel like it'll be cool when Next adds, I'm going to assume that they're going to have some sort of like suspended links for, loading routes and things like that using a probably like a transition or whatever it is that they're going to call it. But yeah, this React location concept is very interesting in that sense. I feel like type safety is kind of the missing piece that hasn't gotten potentially enough love for the routing world. And there are some RFCs open for Next.js to like add better type safety to this. I think Blitzes is my favorite I've seen so far, where they just code gen an awesome, set of factory functions that let you create all the links for you. I feel like that's for me, that's like pretty ideal as long as it also exports types. You just you kind of got to be careful because for our app we have so many routes that like that'll actually be a pretty massive file potentially. In my case, it's totally worth it, but I just don't know as a standard if people would be okay with that or not. So
Totally understandable. See a
got a
puppy
puppy.
coming in. Oh, yeah. We actually talked about this with Brandon last week. We had him on the show to talk about like Blitz and TRPC and like the Next.js
Yeah.
module plugin ecosystem. And a lot of these ideas came up. And as per usual, my conclusion is Next.js is poorly typed at best and feels like we're doing a lot of heavy lifting to fix that. It's not necessarily that like Next.js was poorly designed and as such the types are bad. It's Next.js was designed before TypeScript was really a thing. And it feels like we haven't like taken the time as a community to revisit these patterns with type safety at the core of how we do it. It's I remember some tweet I saw recently that's like TypeScript forced me to write less clever JavaScript because I don't want to deal with the bullshit around the typings. I love that tweet because it's such a good self-own where this person admitted that they didn't fully understand what their JS bullshit was doing because if they did, the types would be easy to define. The thing about types is they force you to understand all the parts of the flows that you create and build. And I feel like there are things in Next.js that Guillermo and crew kind of get and know work, but don't understand with enough confidence to make big assertions in the type definitions that are provided. Things like use router, they could be more strict with it, but they know some users are doing weird shit. And if they add a strict rule, people are going to complain. And they don't have enough use cases themselves to test these new solutions. Or, as we discussed earlier, the incentive because they're comfortable. They know what they have works. And as such, it's weirdly fallen on the community to solve these problems. And something like Blitz is really interesting because it almost feels like a type safety consideration layer wrapping Next.js itself with a lot of other convenient parts. And I'm curious if you've seen the same, like if you have the same feel of we need to reconsider these things post TypeScript.
It's difficult because from the perspective of Next, it's once you define an API like this, you can't really go back. And like I remember when they were first defining dynamic routes and I wanted it so badly. And one of the maintainers basically said something like, once we do this, like literally millions of apps are going to depend on it. And I think it's like one of the just like the generally difficult things of running such a successful project is you need to kind of predict what the future is. And weirdly, by not adding types yet, it's like more safe to maintain for the long haul because you continually have optionality for how you're going to add types in the future if you're going to. I would say it's the part that surprised me in general is just the fact that people actually write strings for links. Like that to me is scary. Like I don't want to write strings in line for anything. So I always have a function that's wrapping something or a type that's wrapping something. And I see code snippets from like real apps all the time where people do that. You know, where either with a lack of factor function or a lack of cogen of any kind, and it's just clearly not type safe. And I think, yeah, I feel like I get it. You know, Next was clearly created at a time where TypeScript was in no way popular, and I feel like they've adopted it really nicely. It's like super seamless to use. But there's definitely an open challenge to like if you have a big team, it's easy because you can have people who do testing and you can have people who are doing all your maintenance and making sure that everything's right. And if there's a refactor, you have someone dedicated to all that. But I feel like type safety makes it so that you can grow a company with fewer people just because it's basically someone's replacing someone's job potentially of just like ironing out all these kinks for a refactor and making sure that your href prop isn't doing something totally broken. So yeah, I mean I would love to have better type safety in general. It's the kind of thing I'm thinking about all the time. I think that React Navigation has done a really good job with this where they've prioritized it a ton for React Native. They've really gone in on letting you customize your types. And what I like about it is it's like not super pretty and it actually takes a bit to learn. Like it took me a while to like set up all like the complex types for React Navigation on React Native, kind of a mouthful, but it's super nice now. And I wonder if there could be some sort of similar level of abstraction that could just be put on top of Next.js. At the very least, it could be just like some sort of opt-in thing, and then you could just use declaration merging for it. I found that to be a really good method where you just can globally set all your styles from one place in one file. I feel like that kind of thing could happen in Next.js if, at the very least, we had the right generics for it.
I think you could get pretty far there. If you just add a single like default or watched export of like export route query params that has like a defined structure of the query params that this particular route expects, and then have a code gen step that just generates all that and stuffs it in use router, that could get you like 80+% of what we're looking for here, I think. And then add like one additional step that is similar to PathPeta, where it gives you a safe set of strings to call from. I think that would solve most of why I would want this. I'm curious if you think that would like cover the majority case.
Yeah, I mean, PathPeed is honestly fine for that reason. In that, like, I mean, it's way better than what I had before. So I really have to give them credit. It's like a great project. If you haven't used PathPeed before and you have a lot of routes, I definitely recommend it, because you inside of the actual page file, you just export, your query parameter object, and then it has a type safe query parameters. So like, that's really cool, and it's been really nice. But I don't even know if I needed to use router hook, because I don't actually use that directly. Like, I already have a wrapper that creates type safe query parameter readers, and it also works with React Native and React Navigation's route parameters. So I basically wrapped both of those and added a type safe layer, and it also does null checks based on if you're. I mean, that part's kind of complicated, but it basically knows if it should give you a nullable value or not based on if you're parsing in the query parameter string or not. So like, a common case is like, using query parameters as state is risky because someone could put an invalid state in. So for example, if you do like, search filters and you have 3 filters, like, you only want to let someone use one of those 3. So in our case, we have this parse function that parses the query parameter, and if it's not one of those 3 that are valid from the query parameter, then it'll just set it to one of the valid ones. That kind of stuff. So I kind of already have type safety there, but it's very custom. Like, I need to make it myself and maintain it myself. And yeah, I think it'd be awesome to at least have some sort of baked in level for it. I care a little bit less about the query parameters once I'm reading them in, and mostly just when I go to one page from one page to another, I want to make sure I'm not messing up the URL, and I want to be able to refactor the URLs or the paths very easily in my pages folder, and not be scared that I just broke everything and that I messed up, all my routes.
I hadn't thought of it in the refactor sense. Yeah, I don't think I could confidently change a route right now. I go as far as, whenever I do, going into the next config and creating a bunch of rewrites for the old URL to the new one, just to make sure that things get there if there are old links. I feel like I do that just as much because users might have old links though. And I am somewhat okay with the pattern of encouraging developers to treat URL paths as somewhat static and to continue honoring them long term. I agree that the solution here isn't to tie a gun to your foot and pull the trigger every time someone takes a bad step, but I do think it's important for us as web developers to do our best to honor a URL for as long as possible. So this is interesting. Because of that, I haven't thought of this problem too much, but that doesn't mean this problem shouldn't be solved.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think it's important to have a strict contract for a URL to be, the same over time. That can be also solved with things like redirects, as long as you're mindful of it. I think it's just important in the early stages of a project, actually, because you're still figuring it out before you've launched. So, I feel like everything always starts out for me as like home screen and dashboard screen, and like, I don't know what to call it. And then I just end up changing it a bunch. And once you ship, it's definitely different. I think the important part is just knowing that even if you accidentally change it, that I want my app to break. Like, I want to be known at the compile step that you have invalid routes. Even DocuSource does this well, where it just crawls your entire app when you build these docs, and it says like, hey, you have a local route inside of your app that's just not valid. I feel like something like that would even be cool, where it could just like be an automated testing system for checking all my link components and like router push calls to ensure that I'm not doing anything that wouldn't actually map to a real endpoint or a real page.
That would actually be relatively trivial to write as like a parser. I'm way too busy already. But yeah, I guess this is an open call for anybody here listening. If you want to go write a parser that goes through all the link components in a Next.js app and make sure those resolve to something in pages that's real, that could get you a lot of value pretty quick. And with Vercel's current hiring trends,
They're really doing something great. Yeah, I mean, it's clearly working. Amazing product, and I mean, the team keeps getting better.
can I hire
It's
some
really,
TypeScript people already?
I love using it. So yeah, I'm not like super up to date with who they've gotten, but I see some cool announcements every other day on Twitter, and I think what Guillermo and the team have built is super exciting.
Totally agree. I know that there was some chatter in chat about Vercel being late on TypeScript, and I totally agree. And I feel like that's still in their hiring one of the things that they are continuing to miss. Yeah, I hope that at the very least they start to take the energy around these problems more seriously, even if they don't invest in solving them themselves, that people like us, like Alex on TRPC, like Brandon on Blitz, and all of the work we are doing, all the things we are writing, content engineering, and work to make it so we can ship with more confidence will be taken more seriously. We're not doing this for fun. Like, we're not out here making things more type safe to flex. We're doing it because we have experienced how much better we can move, how much more confidence we can move with, and how much more effective we can deliver solutions to our users when our code gives us red squiggly lines when we fuck up.
Yeah, I mean, I think they don't they now have the person who created SWC though, and I saw that he was doing a port of
Yeah.
TypeScript that was supposedly
Yeah.
a lot faster. I feel like that looked pretty exciting.
So that's, I could do like a whole hour about the challenges of porting TSC. A lot of people have tried and nobody's gotten close, simply because of the generic structure of in JavaScript itself and how extensible everything is, and the amount of work that went into TypeScript and the TypeScript compiler to honor that through a lot of different JavaScripty techniques, and in particular stuff like generics and the way they're implemented, are very hard to represent in other programming languages, especially in a performant enough way to actually see significant wins. On top of that,
Mm.
it makes it way harder for new features to be implemented, tested, and iterated on as changes are made to the compiler. Like, the TypeScript compiler evolves very quickly. Like, optional chaining was a somewhat
Yeah.
recent addition, and we get cool stuff regularly. Keeping up with that and trying out new things like that, if you have to do it in Golang, and there's like 5 people who can contribute it instead of the 5,000 plus that contribute to TypeScript now, that's a different world. And as exciting as it is, I don't think it's real. I really don't. And I will, somebody clip this one. I would love more than anything to be wrong on this. There is not going to be a real alternative to the TypeScript compiler that isn't written in JavaScript or TypeScript for at least 5 years. Just, it cannot happen. It is so much work. And believe me, I would love to eat my words. I cannot wait for a future where I share this clip and say, fuck, I was wrong. But I won't be. This is way too hard to do, and no one person and no amount of money is going to change that.
I wish I had some insight here. I honestly, it's not the kind of thing I know much about. I just kind of run TSC, and you know, would be happy if it were quicker. But you know, I guess I would imagine, given how fast Microsoft ships stuff and everyone who contributes ships stuff for TypeScript, I could, from the outside, totally understand that argument. I mean, it seems like incredibly complicated. I actually am super impressed by how quickly they ship updates, and all the updates are like exactly what I want. Like, they just, I think in TypeScript 4.6, I never know the names of these features. They always are kind of weird to me. They're very like engineering names. But the new feature where you can have basically a union of two different objects and check, for example, you could have like type car and type bus. And then the car type has a bunch of things and the bus type has a bunch of things. And you can just check like you can destructure the props now and check if type is car or bus, and then you get all the other variables. This is like such a common thing I want to do with TypeScript. They already improved it a little bit in 4.4, I think, but now in 4.6, it's like unbelievable how nice that is for multiple kinds of types. And especially for us, where we have like different kinds of buyers and different kinds of artists in a marketplace of all sorts of users, it's so nice for optional type safety across unions. But yeah, I agree. It's sounds difficult. I definitely wouldn't short Vercel on their ability to solve hard problems like this, but it's probably not their undertaking, to make TypeScript faster. Like, it sounds like a pretty big thing, and all in all, maybe it's good enough anyway. Like, there might be harder problems that are still left to solve. I'd prefer to see actually some involvement for working with native. I think it's probably on their radar, but what I would really be interested in is getting the opinions of people who have seen, more products than I have, of how this stack might be unified. Like, I've spent a lot of time trying to get web and native to work together and not sacrifice performance. But I'm not a framework builder, and I don't know the ins and outs of like the best way to potentially do that necessarily, when it comes to things like tree shaking and like smaller bundles. And so I'm curious to see in the future if, I mean, I saw that Expo is going to give more attention to web this year, which is really exciting. And I wonder if at some point, Vercel will be interested in, in native in a similar way. But I'm definitely excited for, the things that the team at Expo is doing, because they've really opened a lot of doors for me to be able to work on really cool stuff cross platform.
Yeah, huge shout out Expo. Those guys have I wouldn't have gotten into mobile dev again if it wasn't for the hard work they're doing and like the personal efforts from Charlie and crew that have worked with me. I actually hope we'd have Charlie on the show soon, like very soon even. So it's really cool that they've benefited you as much as they've benefited me, possibly even more so, considering how much more time you spend on the mobile side. I don't think there's a GitHub page I reference more than Expo/packages to show people what the React Native ecosystem looks like now. Here's a list of hundreds of packages you can npm install and not think about battery indication management on iOS and Android. You install Expo battery, and now you could import this thing that gives you the current battery percentage on whatever device you're using. These problems are so much harder to solve in native land, and the fact that I can install something via npm, embed these native packages, and be done is magical.
They are solving such hard problems. It's it's really great. It scales really well because once they solve it, it's solved. It doesn't really get reintroduced in the future, and it's like they have a good contract of like putting out very stable software that is similar to Next. I mean, they kind of, which is why this is why I've invested so much time in both these stacks. I think that they both kind of provide a very profitable long-term business model where they're have strong businesses built around them, and I know they're going to be in for the long haul, and they're shipping just like really high quality software that they have solved all these hard problems for. And like I probably like under 10 times have I spent like more than 10 minutes in Xcode, besides like a few times I was trying to experiment with Bluetooth. But like it's kind of crazy. Like we have thousands of people using our product all the time, and like I've never opened Android Studio before. I get to kind of push all these problems off to the side, and they solve them. And so I don't have to learn anything about Swift. And it was kind of a long path because in the past, like React Native's performance was very noticeably worse, but I think it's been a worthy investment because now like it's really been catching up, and you can really create apps with a native feel. So it's nice to have people that are so smart working on these problems all the time.
Couldn't agree more. I say this a lot about groups like Planet Scale too. It feels like I have a 50-person best-in-class data infrastructure team handling my SQL database and the layer to connect to it for me, and can bug them whenever I have a problem. They'll usually go fix it pretty fast. The alternative would be hiring a team to do that. And I think that's the case with Expo too. Like the alternative to Expo isn't you go write a native iOS and Android app, or even that you go write a React Native app yourself. It's that you hire a team. And it's cool that these technologies have gotten to the point where, yes, you could say they're like killing and replacing jobs. I would argue they're allowing for people to do much more independently, and they're allowing for somebody like me to go build a full-on Zoom clone myself, and they're allowing people like you to do all of client for mobile and web for a pretty successful and growing startup.
Yeah, no, I think it's like the most positive something I could think of. It's really fantastic, and they're just it's very responsive and like fun to work with, and I'm always continually impressed.
People in chat keep talking about Remix for some reason, and I guess I have not made my stance there clear enough. I will, fuck it, I've been planning on committing to this for a while. Next week, I will build a Remix app on stream, and once and for all, explain the things I do and don't like and why, because I'm tired of this being half of my chat. You guys get what you want. We're going to talk about Remix next week. The more you mention it in chat right now, the less happy I'm going to go into the Remix chat next week. So be kind, stop spamming me with it for a little bit if you want any chance of a nice take. Sorry, I've been trying to keep an eye on chat, and what every other message is Remix. It's really frustrating because it feels like Remix has spent more time marketing than building.
Interesting. I mean, I haven't really paid too much attention to it, but reading the Remix versus Next.js breakdown, I thought was like super compelling. I thought they did a really good job of comparing the two. It all made a lot of sense to me, having built like a large scale app, and I was really intrigued because I still love Next, but I love a really technical breakdown of that sort. It's just like, yeah, I would want to see for myself. And I posted like a discussion question on Remix asking if, what their perspective is on React Native and like if it might fit in together and stuff. And I haven't heard back yet. So I feel like it's kind of contingent on that for me. Is like, is there some sort of way? Because I think it's cool that they're going all in on these web APIs, but I'd want to know, like, is there a way to, combine the two under the hood somehow?
I detested that article. Fred FKS, he built Astro. Him and I did a stream a week or so ago, like right when it dropped, and kind of just railed on it for an hour straight. He forgot to record it, so I don't have the VOD, sadly. It's been killing me since. But my problem with the article is you can tell that they rewrote it very late, and that the numbers they wrote it with initially were much better. And now that the numbers were different, they filled it with a lot of like technical points to make up for the difference and a lot of promises on things that aren't there yet. Like the fact that most of the tests required them to use Next image and the images hosted through Vercel's like Next.js like builder to have performance numbers that were reasonable was very telling. It's like, yeah, Remix theoretically could be better, but a lot of the things you need to ship an app, like pictures, we don't do yet. So you still have to use other tools. In fact, we just used the one that was built into Next and just stole the URLs and dropped them in our Remix app instead. And there's a lot of, somebody else in chat just made the point, like Remix can't do anything Next can't, but it has better patterns and no lock-in. I disagree with the last part, but I do very much agree with the first. There are some cool ideas around the data loading. Like we mentioned earlier, the idea of like a route or a component that blocks on the data coming in and lets you have a load state. And then when the page is done loading or the route change is done occurring, that's when the user sees the new content. Remix has a cool loading pattern, but it has some of the hardest lock-in I've ever seen for that loading pattern. When you use Remix, and you won't be able to move off it. But yeah, this is why I said no more Remix. Topic is done now. Next week, I will rant more about it. There's way too much to talk about, and most of chat is wrong. So back to the topic. There are some other really cool messages. One earlier that I didn't catch because it was on YouTube. I didn't have it open. This is from Mateo. Reanimated makes performant animations possible. Modi makes performant animations easy. I love this framing. I think this is such a cool point. I wish I mentioned it earlier when we were talking about it. Curious of your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I definitely agree. It even adds some, little by little, I've been including, basically, there's no capability at this point you can do with Reanimated that you can't do with Modi, because any prop Reanimated accepts, Modi does too. So you can actually use them together entirely. It's just a layer on top that, it fully extends it. But that's, yeah, it's a pretty good one. If that quote's out there somewhere, just send me a screenshot and maybe I'll put it on the site. It's interesting about Remix. It's just it's not something I know much about. I just kind of hear about it from Twitter and like reading about it. I'm kind of very deep in my stack of Next.js and React Native, but I'm always really curious to see if I'm doing something that could be better. Like when I read things about like projects like Vite, and I'm like, oh, this is really cool. I don't know if I'm gonna change things up at this point until I see like enough people saying it's a good move to do so.
Absolutely agree. I was actually shipping Vite in production for a while as an alternative to Next when
it's Vite. Is that how it's pronounced? Oh.
It's supposed to be pronounced Vite. I only recently caved. I've been calling it Vite and got enough shit from chat that I stopped. But it's like one of those GIF versus GIF where GIF is the right pronunciation, but GIF's the way it's pronounced. Let's be real. So I'm probably going to give up and start saying Vite again, but I'm insecure because chat gives me a lot of shit when I call it Vite. Same with a Deno. Deno was named Deno by the creator when he announced it. They retroactively changed it to Dino.
Oh, okay, good. Because
it was Deno when he announced it.
Okay. It's always hard to know these software names because I don't ever like meet these people in person. I just read about it. It's like I say Babel. Is it Babel?
I think it's Babel.
It's Babel,
not sure
right?
though.
Okay, I've heard someone say Babel once, and I was thrown. I was like, I don't know how to say that. But,
the only thing software developers are worse at than naming things is talking, so it makes sense that we suck at both here. As for the like when to make the change question, I am always willing to play with new things just because it's fun for me, especially if I see potential value. Like I was playing with Astro, ended up with a much more performant like static site solution, and ported my whole like brand and like core site and blog over to it because it worked great for that. It makes no sense for the web app we use. When I originally started building Ping, I built it with like a Create React app, Vite app. I caught myself putting way too many things in the API directory. That felt dirty. I decided to try Next.js again because I hadn't used it for a while and thought it would be a good fit for that, and fell in love all over again, especially when I combined things like TRPC to allow me to have one endpoint that serves all sorts of different things with like type safe data. I got much more into like the parts being connected, and very soon after, the combination of like Vercel acquiring KD1 Dev, the guy who makes SWC, and like the effort they put into getting that into Next.js, I ended up with very similar build performance to what I was getting in Vite in Next, because Next.js team saw these other things going on, saw the best value, which is this thing is faster. Cool, we can make the same happen here. We're going to use Rust instead of Go, but generally the same thing. Worked out great. I think even with Remix, if some of the patterns in there do end up being very compelling, I don't think I get them by going to Remix. I think I get them by waiting for them to come to me.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I feel like that's I mean, the market response. I mean, there's going to be some good competition here, and I can't imagine if there are good enough patterns that they'll be impossible to bring into Next. And I definitely would not bet against Vercel innovating on any sort of build performance or like I mean, they know what they're doing, and I'm sure that Next is just going to keep improving. So it's hard for me to bet against that team. And so far, I mean, Next I think has been pretty great. But I like the waterfalls in the network tab. I thought that was pretty cool. I'm curious to see you know what the sort of long term reaction to that will be in Next.js, if things will go back a little bit to the server or if things will sort of stay in this pseudo static thing.
So on that point, I think that the thing I agree the most on with the core like Remix team and like that one article is that get server side props is a bad pattern. It just is. The idea of blocking time to first byte on a server response for anything is almost always bad. Get the user some fucking HTML and do it as fast as you can. It's just so much better an experience for the user. And the thing that makes most of the examples in that blog as bad as they were was the use of server side props as a function to get all of the data necessary to render the page that blocks the entirety of it, whereas Remix gives you a first render and then the loader pulls in other data in the pieces that need it when like they render next. It allows you to have that waterfall just because the ownership model is destructured in a way where you can not block that first byte and still block for the individual components. Thankfully, React itself does this now with React streaming. And I saw somebody link the post. Good luck to the Remix team to get React server components working with streaming in Remix with the way that they rebuilt it themselves. I'd love to be wrong on this. I'd love to see it work well with streaming. But generally speaking, I think we get this win for free in React or in Next.js because of the hard work going into React server components.
Could be true. I don't know much about the server components. So, my question is always, how will this work with React Native? It probably won't because all the React Native components have hooks. So, like React Native in general doesn't play very well on the server. This is like the first year of my life building Dripsy is trying to fit it for server side rendering and eventually just opting out altogether and just only doing client side rendering and maintaining inside of Next.js. But yeah, I mean, it's what interested me the most was Hydrogen, Shopify's sort of framework that was using server components. I took a look at that and I thought that was pretty cool. But it seems like it's gonna be pretty cool. It's hard for me to say what Remix's role is going to be in that, if any. But I really like the fact that React 18 seemed like this really super distant thing, and then Vercel was just like, "Yeah, you can use it with us. Like, it'll work with Next.js. Like, just try it out. We're using it." Like, I feel like they really push the experimental text to be used in the experimental tech, stack to be used in production.
I want to dive in a bit on the React Native server components things. I haven't thought about that, and that is really interesting. How do you feel as a React Native focused developer on the direction of React Native as a whole? Do you feel like React Native's being left behind, or do you think it's managing to like keep up and stay a focus?
No, I actually think the innovations in React Native might be the biggest ones. I mean, I think the future of React Native, where they're giving all this focus to like incredibly performant native feel to apps with things like the new Fabric renderer and turbo modules and just an easier interface between iOS and Android and JavaScript that's type safe is super exciting to me. Reanimated is one example of this where they're able to have this incredibly high performance, and it's not something I'm like, super understanding of how it works under the hood, but it's my understanding that I think they're doing something like sharing objects between C++ and JavaScript or something of the sort, or at the very least, it's working really fast. So I actually think the innovations in React Native are super exciting, and they're all going to depend on concurrent rendering. So even if server components itself isn't super clear to me how that's going to work, I'm pretty excited about the combination of the concurrent rendering plus the new Fabric render on React Native, it seems like it's gonna be like an absolutely huge performance boost, especially for things like search, which we have to do now, which is like a really expensive thing to run on native, and you have to like debounce the search input so that you don't send too many requests and you can't interrupt the rendering. I think that's going to be like a big time boost for native. But yeah, I'm still a bit unclear on what the official position is of React Native Web because it's not officially maintained by the React Native team. It's maintained by Nicholas, who like I don't understand how one person can do that. It's like literally mind blowing to me to port the entire React Native API over to web and make it super performant and like easy to use, and it's like doesn't have any bugs. It's pretty amazing. So it's still kind of it hasn't really been touched on much in my opinion of how React Native on the website is going to fit in with the server components structure. But I think when it comes to the iOS and Android side, the upcoming innovations are actually like super exciting. Like it seems like they're continually narrowing the gap of what it feels like to download a native iOS app and a React Native iOS app. And that's like I think that's pretty huge because JavaScript is clearly so much easier to build with, but you want to make sure that people don't have like a degraded experience.
Ryan, the lead dev on Solid, just mentioned in chat that he's very excited for React Native for web, and that the exploration of changing the fundamental web abstraction seems like an area where we can make a real difference. I'm assuming being like him with his work on Solid and like all of us potentially like
Very
chatting about
interesting.
these things in the future. But I very much agree. One of the things that I really liked about Solid is the primitives it provides, where I don't feel like Solid is a way for me to structure an application so much as a set of primitives that I can use. Like it's the building blocks I use to build. Whereas Next.js has really good building blocks, but it is the whole house. And inside of it, there are really useful things for me to use to build, but I don't own the house. Next.js does. Remix is a really nice house that's empty on the inside. Solid is a bunch of little blocks that I could build my own cool house with. And I feel like I've thought about this a bit. It almost feels like things like the signal and observable patterns in RxJS and Solid stuff like that as core web primitives would be really powerful building blocks. And if we were to take that a step further and build just a better fundamental like web abstraction layer for doing the right thing on the web platform to have the most performant way to update our applications possible, that could benefit everyone, and including React Native for web especially. So yeah, really interesting thought.
Yeah, I think React Native for web, I mean, it's probably used by like millions of repos and stuff, but it's like still just mind blowing to me how underrated it is. It is the best UI abstraction layer I've seen for React. Using divs is not, and like CSS classes with cascading styles that can be set globally is such a poor fit for a component based framework that I'm surprised it hasn't become a bit more of a default. And I think it's just because the name, it's like you think it's only for React Native apps, but I've actually built just some websites and I still use React Native for web. Um, Especially because, when I was first starting Dripsy, the styling systems out there and like all the styling solutions, there were like basically no modern options that were performant, but now there are a ton. I feel like a lot of people have seemingly agreed with my premise, whether they came to it themselves or hearing, kind of my constant talking about it, that there's like a future of building apps both on native and web sharing code. And there have been some like really exciting projects that have come out styling wise. Like there are many like Tailwind React Native projects now. Some of them also have responsive design and dark mode support cross platform. There are, a lot of cool styling systems like that. So yeah, I think it's cool to see it'll be cool to see if projects like Solid and things like that, like how they can fit in with this sort of UI layer, even if they're not using hooks, because that's kind of my biggest blocker every time I see one of these new really cool like reactive libraries, whether they're just a layer on top of React or their own thing. Is does it fit this sort of approach I'm taking, which is I want to write code that I can run with high performance on any platform, not just on web, and like avoid the escape hatches of writing pseudo elements and classes that you don't know what order they run in and things like that, but instead to rely on, much more stable contracts that React Native Web provides.
Yeah, absolutely. That's it's really interesting because I've always thought so much about like the React Native abstraction layer as the place to do the best thing for mobile. But what's interesting here is by letting another like team to an extent own that, you're almost like forcing people's hands to whatever you consider best practice. And as long as you do that well enough, you could theoretically paint over some of the rougher parts and like the weird flexbox behaviors. Like I spent an hour fighting flexbox because the height didn't have a min width 0 in the right place, so it wasn't expanding properly. No matter what we did, min height 0 is a meaningless statement. It says this thing can be as small as 0 pixels, but I have to throw that all over the place for things to work. And if you abstract that away in a layer like React Native for web, you could have an experience as good as the React Native experience I have every day when I build React Native apps. If you type a thing and it usually does what you expect. I do like the idea of both on the web side building better primitives to enable that, and on the like developer tooling side and something like React Native, forcing the right solutions to be targeted.
Yeah, I also I see a comment here that after building a big React Native web project, someone wouldn't do it again. I think that's kind of how I felt before. It's like, in my opinion, there's sort of two layers here. It's like, do you have the right abstraction and do you have the right code? And the way I've always viewed it, and like the reason I'm building all these libraries is because, in my opinion, React Native for native and for web is the right abstraction. It just wasn't there yet, right? The actual implementation wasn't there yet. There's no navigation solution. There's no way to do styling across them. There's no way to animate. There's no way to handle URL query parameters on both native and web. And there's just a bunch of issues like this. A lot of the libraries out there just don't work for both because they have their own platform-based implementations. But I feel like the thing that really gets me interested in it is just that it is the right abstraction. There's no real fundamental difference between a browser and an app. Like the only if you look on a mobile website and an app like Instagram's website, it's basically the exact same thing. Twitter's website, which is built with React Native, looks the exact same as the mobile app, right? They're basically mimicking the exact same thing, just to the constraints of the browser. And at the end of the day, if you just took the top and bottom bars off of a mobile browser, you're basically just looking at the app, but you have like, some worse capabilities because it's running in this browser container. And to me, it's just all about the abstraction. And once the abstraction is right, you can build the right things for it very easily. And I feel like that's kind of the piece that gets missed. It's like, it's definitely easier, right? It would have been easier a year ago just to build a website with React. But since we focused on abstracting to the React Native layer and making them both fit together, and we built these primitives for animations and navigation, other things, now we just have to write once. And so I think we just I just need more people, and there actually has been like a really amazing community forming around this over the last few months, which has been like super exciting. But for a long time, it was kind of just like me out there dealing with, what realistically was a stack that was not there yet, but that had this hope because I was convinced that the abstraction was correct.
I'm about to say something I might regret, but I like this framing too much to not. I feel like I do a lot of shit posting around Flutter. I think it's fundamentally wrong and bad. And I feel like a lot of the developers in the Flutter ecosystem are spending a lot of time trying to make Flutter work and target things more like React does. I think you're the first developer I've talked to that's trying to make React Native and React work more like Flutter, where it's an abstraction on top of the different places it runs that you write once and then it works in all of those places.
Oh, well, I'm not sure if you're making the comparison to what I said to be like Flutter. I guess the difference is that React Native in its targets turns into the actual target components.
Yes.
So like, it's my understanding. I don't know much about Flutter, but it's my understanding
It
that
runs a
on
canvas
web, for
on
example,
web.
they're just spinning up a canvas. Yeah, so it's like you couldn't even. I mean, maybe some people seems like it could work for like a game, but at least for me, that could never work. Like I need to inspect element all the
Yes.
time, and like I want to be able to have actual. I'm not even sure how that would work if you need like to read the content on the page out loud to yourself or something. Like I'm not
Yeah, like
sure how
screen
that
readers and
would
stuff are a
work.
total nightmare, and there's a lot of custom stuff that has to be done as a result. It's like 15 layers of shit to get roughly to like, because you're reinventing the whole browser at that point, and
Yeah,
on
even if
mobile
they
you're doing
solve
the
those
same.
problems, right? I think that this is why I think React Native is the right abstraction, because even if you solve all those problems, if you solve accessibility, and I mean, there's clearly some good things to Flutter. I feel like they've created probably. My guess is I mean, if people are using it, I assume it never made sense to me, but I would guess there's some benefit to it. The thing is, I find that React Native is a great abstraction because it's very future proof. Because the thing you're coding now will always turn into the target platform. So like React Native Web is just a wrap around React DOM, and React Native for iOS is just a wrapper around native components and or native elements. And I feel like that is the abstraction I feel confident in using. And it's already a layer on top, but I want it to be a layer on top of something that I understand. Like I can poke in through React Native Web's code and like I know how websites work, so I can just edit it. And using something like a canvas is just like way too big of a jump for me. Like it doesn't, it's not yeah, it's just to keep using the word. Like I don't think it properly abstracts a layer on top.
To be clear, what I meant was it was not necessarily that the way they're doing it is something similar to what you're doing. It's the general idea of write once, run everywhere that you get from a good abstraction. Your abstraction is almost a translation layer where it turns what you write into the best solution for that platform. Their solution is it's a full-on like black box like separation an isolation layer between what you write and what's run on the platform. Where you are targeting Skya, and Skya is the engine that runs. You are, as a developer, thinking about and targeting React Native, but what runs is native to the platforms that you're targeting. And I really like that idea because it is taking what React Native was built for to the next level. But more importantly, I feel like it's achieving that write once, run everywhere goal that a lot of other things, including like Xamarin and now Flutter, have strived for and failed because they didn't start from web.
Yeah, I guess React Native is fundamentally inspired by web because it looks like writing web code. I mean, it started out as just writing iOS apps that look like writing HTML to some degree. So it's definitely like circular. You're starting with web and taking the best of web and using it in native and then bringing it back to web. And I actually find this is what's been happening for me. On our website, I use a ton of mobile navigation patterns like a consistent header and changing titles and a back button that's responds when you're on top of a stack and modals that persist based on URL and you can always pop back to the previous page. Because I got so used to those native patterns, I brought them to web. And I think it's just kind of similar of what the fundamental of React Native was, which is taking the best of web and using it as a way to build on iOS. And then suddenly they were like, oh, this is a pretty good abstraction. We built a great API. Let's use it on web. And even though these issues like navigation were super behind, I think it's really close to having sort of a fully unified API for both. I should also mention someone said on there that the navigation was too split apart and that there's no good solution for it. I am working on a new library for that. If someone happened to use Next.js and React Native, I'm going to have essentially a fully unified code base for the two, and I think it's going to be very exciting.
I am so excited for that to be shared. Do you have a rough timeline of when we'll be able to take a look at that?
I mean, technically, if you're sleuthy enough, you could find it now. And because I tend to just like make all my stuff in public even from the start. So it's called Solito. The idea is like a solo developer can build for everyone, and this is going to be the abstraction for it. The main thing is going to be the docs, which I guess I don't have a link out there for, but I would imagine it's going to be less than a few weeks. I already have like a really long thread on like some pull requests with like dozens of people that have responded on it that have like given feedback. So we've been going back and forth on this for months with many people. It's like a whole community formed around it, deciding the right APIs and the right approach. And it ultimately ended up being a very headless thing where you use, web pages on web, iOS screens on native, but the code is shared, but you don't have to import React navigation ever on web. You don't have to you can leave the navigation to each one of them. And the way it works is your screens are the same, but the navigation is a skeleton. So you create a shared screen component. You can import it in your native app. You can import it in your web app. But then Next.js handles the routing and React Navigation handles the routing. And they're totally separate. And then I just create a library where you call, you have a link component, exact same API as Next Router. And even if you weren't using React Native, you could import these functions and they would work on your Next.js app. So it's totally portable. It's exact same APIs you're used to. And then if you happen to want to use React Native on iOS too, you just use the same Next.js APIs you're used to, and it goes to all the same screens. So like it's all handled based on URLs, And I'm basically just taking the Next.js APIs for links and use router and bringing that to native.
Very, very interesting. My immediate next ask is when can I include data fetching and loading blocking patterns as well? But I know that that's probably why you were so excited about things like what we saw in React Location, because if those abstractions get really good in something like Next.js, you would be able to add them into what you've built somewhat trivially. Is that roughly what the
Definitely.
vibe I was getting?
Yeah, yeah. I've actually like manually imported these in a few places. Like sometimes I have a link and I'll just like literally like prefetch the next page and I'll show a spinner and then I'll go. Like I don't know how great that pattern is. I make it kind of weak. Like if someone hits it twice, I'll just go. But I feel like I've noticed this in like if you open like iOS settings on your phone, for example, if you just go in like the settings, and I think if you click like my subscriptions, it does suspend. This is a pretty common iOS pattern where you click the link, it shows a spinner, and then like 2 seconds later, it opens the next screen, so you don't see a spinner on the next screen. So I've just like manually done that, and it, I guess it works cross-platform as well.
Very interesting. I think that we triggered Alex a bit, where it's way more trivial if your backend is in the same language, which is very much true. If your backend code and your loaders are right there next to the components, and you can like determine which components need what, and then suspend at a like higher level, these things become really trivial. But I think that we're all just we all have the fever of the patterns React server components provide, where I can have a piece of UI that's blocked on a piece of data. So I never have to worry about that piece of UI rendering without that data. And the power of that abstraction is really enticing. And I think we're all looking for it as we look into new routing solutions. But what's really exciting here with what you've built is again like the horizontal versus vertical. You've built a very horizontal routing solution, when right now all of the discussions about vertical ones, where React Router became Remix, it became a vertical solution, where something like React Location just does one piece, but it makes the data loading coming in much more trivial as well. The try to find the right way to like make this ask. Do you feel as though React Native inherently has to be more horizontal because of the like platforms it's targeting? And have you seen any work in the React Native community to have a more like vertical consideration of things like data and fetching from the server as these solutions are built?
I feel like React Native is just more the UI layer. And the nice thing is that every time React ships updates, React Native just gets to use them. I think server components is probably the big exception here so far. I mean, who knows? Maybe they'll come up with something for React Native, but I feel like what React Native has done very well is the API for the UI layer and making that like very straightforward and extensible for basically any platform. So I think there is some risk. Like there are no hooks specific to React Native besides a few like platform dimensions and things like that. But for the most part, I feel like they're sticking to the UI layer. And I feel like when it comes to turbo modules and these like kind of new innovations that'll let us build really fast, like synchronous APIs, maybe they'll have to provide more kind of stuff there. But I just want to honestly, I would prefer them just like keep doing what they're doing now, but be more concrete about like stability of certain platforms. Like I would love to know how the official React Native team views web as a target. Um, like obviously, they have a Facebook employee running it, so I'm sure it's a decent priority, and tons of big companies depend on it. Um, but yeah, I feel like that would just be interesting, especially as they're talking about these great things like the many platforms vision. It seems like they're investing a lot in desktop in addition to native, but I haven't heard too specifically about web. So I feel like I'm more interested in just like, how are they going to keep massaging each platform that they're on, in addition to the upcoming innovations for things like JSI and Fabric on native.
Very much agree. I see the React server components like coming up more and more. And I know we touched on it earlier, the idea of how hard it would be to do something like RSC and like to have proper server component like implementation on mobile. It's my understanding that like the way React server components are implemented, they effectively send like streamed HTML down the wire to fill the place where like the server component is mounted. And I cannot
Okay.
imagine what that would look like on native. And I'm curious if you've like put any thought into what the RSC pattern would look like. Obviously, we benefit much more on mobile from just the raw concurrency and suspense patterns, but really curious, like, is this a streamed VDOM that we're talking about here?
I wish I knew, but I actually think it is something that they're thinking about. I'm pretty sure. I mean, I read this really late at night at some point, but I'm pretty sure when I was reading the docs about the upcoming renderer that they did mention that they have been doing server component, whatever that means. Yeah, I'm not very versed in how server components work and HTML streaming and such, but I'm pretty sure they've been doing this on native apps too. And I can't wait to figure out what that means. And I also want to know if it's going to work on web. But it's my understanding that like rendering, like they're kind of going to end up viewing React Native as just like on iOS as like another browser. I don't want to speak for them because that could be an incorrect interpretation, but it seems like there is also an ambition of doing some sort of server streaming to native apps. Um, I guess I just don't really know explicitly what that like actually means. So I'm curious to see like if that's actually the case. I'm sure they're going to talk more about it in the future, and hopefully not that long. I'm sure there's a lot on their plate with like Fabric and JSI, but that would be quite interesting to see how that would play out on a native app.
Yeah, I'm super excited about it. I don't want to keep us too much longer, but there's a couple more questions I want to just like shoot through quick. If anybody else has a quick question, we can do that. But I definitely want to start wrapping up. And obviously, thank you, Fernando, for sticking or here for as long as you have. This has been one of the coolest sessions we've had so far. Uh, one of the questions was actually, this is an interesting one. What are some of the good modern solutions for React Native apps to support offline mode? I am curious what your thoughts are with that.
I really wish I had a better answer. I don't do any offline mode stuff. I've had some really bad outcomes of doing like intense local caching and not knowing how to properly invalidate it. And then we've had like some really bad bugs where server schemas that have shipped breaking changes haven't matched the local cache of someone's device. And then someone's basically just stuck in a loop. And after I experienced that, we basically just, I besides auth, I don't like do any local storage stuff. I'm sure there are many apps where it's super necessary, like if you're doing chat or maybe in many cases it's needed. Um, if it were me, and like I've thought about it sometimes, but I usually just stay away from it. If it were me, I'd probably just use something like MMKV and build a cache from that, which is a really cool local storage library for native by Mark, who made it synchronous, I believe. So there's no await like async storage, and it also works on web now. I help do a pull request there, which adds web support to it, which just uses local storage. But I know it's not like really an answer because that's just like the implementation. I think most libraries like SWR and React Query and like URQL and stuff like that have a layer where they let you, add in a cache and you're just responsible for writing and reading from it. So I would probably just use MMKV. It's kind of the best on every platform, it seems, because it's fast and it works with Expo. And yeah, that's probably the best option as the middleware between your local cache and your app. But honestly, I have my reservations about using offline mode in general, where I don't need it because cache invalidation is a tricky thing.
Yeah, cache invalidation is one of the toughest challenges I've run into as a developer, and I totally agree with the idea of like minimizing the offlineness of your app as much as possible, making things much easier. That said, I've been in the position where that's not an option. From my experience, the best solution there is to build an abstraction between like the user and their behavior and the server part as well. That could be something like the MKV, like storage, IndexedDB, something like that in the middle, where you do an action and it changes something there, and then it has a state that changes when you've successfully updated. And if there are pending updates, that doesn't trigger. And then as soon as you connect, it does trigger and it flushes whatever updates you have waiting there are to resynchronize that state. Usually the easiest way to do this is I have like big like state chunks that are everything, and I diff them on what like things that are defined or not. It's not the best pattern, but it's good enough to have a quick, like, I have a room state that describes this like place I am, or like a document and I edit the document and then I push those changes, but it doesn't push until I'm networked. Usually there will be cases where my diff assumes there are no changes, but there were. At that point, I just throw an error for the user that says, hey, the document on the server is different from the one you edited. Do you want to persist the one here, or do you want to use the one there? It's really hard to make assumptions for these things, even as a developer that knows all of the potential edge cases. Implementing those in a long-term pattern that will be maintainable forever sucks so hard that I would go out of my way to just make it as little code as possible, even if it doesn't work ideal, because making it work ideal is making a huge nest of bullshit to maintain a long time, and making it work at all will be the easiest thing to delete in the future.
Yeah, I would also say if you're doing offline caching, like you're storing to local storage in some sort, I would make like a pretty aggressive cache invalidation. So I would make it like time if basically what I do whenever I do this is like I have a timestamp of like last time I wrote to the cache. And if I'm opening the app and it's been like over a day, I just clear the cache, like it's out. Or like maybe it's not a day, but whatever that time period is. The more important thing I do is obviously not for auth because people have to stay authenticated always. And I'm not changing the schema for auth. We're just using Firebase. But the other thing I do is have a version number in the app. And if the version number doesn't match the major or minor version of what the last version I had when I cached, I clear it. Like I feel like there's such a high risk, and you want to be able to ship backend changes all the time, in my opinion, or front, whatever it might be. I want to be able to ship changes and not be too concerned. So I kind of view like if you don't need offline mode, that's better, and if you do, like just like do it right.
That actually touched a really interesting thing. I remember that I don't know if I got this question on Twitter or really early in chat. Somebody asked something along the lines of, what does your update story for your React Native apps look like? Like, are you using like Expo application service and push? That's what we all use now, right?
I actually have like a whole thing made for this. I had a Twitter thread about this once. It might be easier if I just link to that because I like to do a whole breakdown of it. I think I actually sent someone it today, but basically I use this thing called Runway for our releases, and it's a combination of major version bumps trigger builds, minor version bumps trigger OTA releases, and Expo has this field in app.config called runtime version, which basically says if you ship OTA update, it will only apply to builds that have the same runtime version, which is super useful because let's say you have build with runtime version 1 and then you add native code. You want to make sure you change the runtime version, because if you add native code and ship an OTA update to a build that doesn't have that native code, it will break. So what we do is anytime we add a new native library or something, we increment the major version. And then whenever I push with a new major version to master, it deploys a new build. And if it's a minor one, it does an OTA. Now the actual mechanism for that with GitHub Actions and stuff is like kind of extensive, and I have a UI on top of all of it with it using this app called Runway. And I have like a Twitter, kind of post about it, and I copied over some like Slack screenshots describing it. So if that's useful, I could share that because I use Expo updates with EAS. I spend a lot of time trying to figure out the best way to do it, and they've even gotten better now with EAS updates and stuff. But I found that to be a really really good flow.
I don't think my setup was quite that complex. I would just push updates pretty much whenever and would follow the same like major updates pattern where I would do a major update. I found that Expo was actually smart enough to, if you made native changes, not give the update to users. Like they had their own internal versioning that would check for native changes and not deploy the new bundle to users. So I relied on that pretty heavily. I was also a very, very early consumer of EAS as well as the new Expo Dev Client stuff.
Yes.
Like over 8 months before it shipped. I didn't know I was as early as I was.
Yeah.
They didn't frame it as alpha as it was. But yeah, it was really good stuff, and we learned a ton from it. I'm seeing a topic come up that I think this actually would be a really good closing topic. It came up both in YouTube and Twitch. It's the idea of React Native minus React, like another JavaScript framework doing a similar thing, like Svelte native or Solid native or Vue native. I am of the belief that this is actually the biggest strength of the React Native VDOM, or the React VDOM, and like the abstraction layer that it represents. It makes it much easier to use React, the framework, to build different targets for it, where React DOMs are a replaceable part. Svelte is Svelte DOM. You can't replace Svelte DOM in Svelte. You cannot replace the DOM in Solid. I don't think this is possible. That said, I would love your thoughts, knowing that you spend even more time on the React Native side, as well as I know there's a lot of smart people in chat that might have thoughts too.
Yeah, I would say this. At the end of this year, and then whenever it is that React Native ships all these new updates, there's going to be this really interesting thing that's happened where they're probably going to have solved most of the really hard problems of porting a JavaScript API onto native APIs. And I feel like this thing that happens in software is people manage to wrap and abstract things. And so then, making React is really hard, but then remaking React once it already exists might not be as hard. And so the question is just, can someone take all the work that the React Native team has done and use their API to do the same thing? Like, is that easy to do or not? Now, my guess is it's so coupled to React itself and concurrent rendering. Like concurrent rendering and suspense and everything apparently is going to be like crucial for the new renderer. So people who know more about this kind of thing would probably have a better opinion on if that's easy to take their work and do it elsewhere. I think it would really hinge on, can other JavaScript frameworks like actually utilize all the work React Native has put in or not? Because they have solved just like so many problems. It's so battle tested. We're talking about like billions of people in the world literally using React Native apps. And I think it'd be really awesome if other people can do it too. It's just, I think it'll just depend. Like, can you build on, Facebook's nearly decade of work doing this? And if you can, then like maybe. I think you're muted here.
Oh, yep. Thank you so much. My bad on that. Yeah, I have like 15 different mute buttons, and I hit 4 of them. Sorry, but yeah, the TLDR. I've seen other things do what you're describing. I know there was Vue Native for a little bit. I don't think it got too far because they were building on top of React Native, and then a huge React Native API shift occurred with like the unimodules change and all that. And they gave up, and I don't think it's been maintained like at all since. So yeah, Vue Native isn't a realistic option. I think Vue has one of the better abstraction layers to build something like a native layer. Supposedly Solid has a decent like ability to swap out the DOM. I haven't looked into the source code enough to know for sure, but I'm definitely down to talk with Ryan about that more in the near future.
Yeah.
I think that's all I have on this.
Well,
any other last minute topics, thoughts, or things you want to mention before we wrap up?
No, all I would say is if anyone is interested in participating in sort of the native Next.js navigation stack or whatever it might be, there are a lot of threads right now that are super active of people that are working on this. So I've tweeted out a good amount of them. So if people just, I guess people can just ping me on Twitter if they're interested, and I can send them the links to that, because we're always looking to have people who are, shipping product and interested in the stack. And if you ever want to book artists, you can do it on our website.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for taking the time. It was awesome having you here. I hope that we can have more conversations with people that aren't just traditional web developers on Web Dev Wednesday. And I hope this is the start of a trend of all sorts of different types of developers showing up for this. So yeah, thank you once again for stopping by. One quick plug myself, if you haven't seen the logo on top, this call has been powered by Ping. We launched officially yesterday, and I'm super pumped with the product. We use Ping to run streams with our friends. It's the easiest way to have a guest on your show, as you can see here. And I love the product, super proud of what we built, and excited for more people to try it out. Thank you guys all again so much for stopping by. Hope to see you guys next week. Peace, y'all.
Thanks for having me.